Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is Aslam Abdullah from IslamiCity live on this Friday evening with one of the most distinguished guests that we all cherish and we all admire from South Africa. IslamiCity is hosting the series on the oppressed people of the world in commemorating the martyrdom of Imam Hussain and trying to figure out how we as Muslims can live the legacy of Imam Hussain in these difficult times and in these situations where people, not necessarily Muslims, have stood up for their dignity and have stood up for their human rights. It is in this particular context that we have discussed the Dalits of India. We have discussed the native tribes of Latin America. We have discussed the indigenous communities in the United States. Today, we are focusing on one of the most daring struggles that shook people of our generation in the last century. We all grew up learning about a man whom we call Mandela and a community that supported Mandela in South Africa in those lonely years where he was alone fighting against the oppression. And in that particular struggle, the Muslims played one of the most significant roles that one can even imagine and one can think in the history of the struggles of the oppressed people. To talk about the oppression, to talk about the apartheid in South Africa, we have none other than one of the brilliant scholars of Islam, Shaykh Sadullah Khan, who is joining us from Cape Town. He was in Los Angeles for a brief period of time, where he was associated with a number of Islamic centers. And I and Alim and many others had the opportunity to learn from him and benefit from his vast knowledge and vast experience. Shaykh Sadullah memorized the Qur'an at the age of 8. And he studied in Egypt. He studied it in USA. He also studied in the United Kingdom and Malaysia, Belgium, Nigeria, Botswana, Canada, Sierra Leone, Iran, Zimbabwe, Sri Lanka, Kuwait, Mexico, and Turkey. He has appeared on SABC, NBC, history channels, as well as the Turkish television. He has spearheaded youth development programs in South Africa and the USA 2 decades, and he has been an inspiring religious leader, motivational speaker, and educator. He currently serves as the CEO of the Islamic College in Cape Town, South Africa. We really are honored to have a person who has dedicated his life to serving Islam and to serving the causes of justice, and who other than him is more capable of talking about the apartheid in South Africa. Welcome to the program, Dr. Brother Sadullah, and the floor is yours. And inshallah, after your presentation, Dr. Walji and myself would be having some discussion with you on the steps forward.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Aslam Abdullah, Dr. Walji, Brother Alim, and to all your viewers and listeners worldwide and those who are participating. We say a Muharram Mubarak. And of course, Alhamdulillah, we are in the sacred month of Muharram, and I feel honored and privileged to be part of this illustrious program and with illustrious company. And I think a topic which I think would inspire, inform, empower many people worldwide. The entire theme, Muharram, a time to remember the oppressed people of the world. My particular theme is apartheid in South Africa, a heroic legacy of principled struggle against racism and injustice. And we want to begin by the verse of the Qur'an where Allah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وما لكم لا تقاتلون في سبيل الله والمستضعفين من الرجال والنساء والولدان الذين يقولون ربنا أخرجنا من هذه القرية الظالم أهلها واجعل لنا من لدنك وليا واجعل لنا من لدنك نصيرا Allah poses a question in Surah An-Nisa, and why should you not fight in the cause of Allah and of those who being weak are ill-treated and oppressed, men, women, and children, whose cry is, our Lord, rescue us from this place whose people are oppressors, and raise for us from thee one who will protect, and raise for us from thee one who will help. And of course, the prophetic tradition that inspires one to commit ourselves to this verse of the Quran, the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam said, أفضل الجهاد كلمة عدل or كلمة حق عند سلطان جائر. The best jihad is to speak the truth to an oppressive ruler, speak truth to power. So alhamdulillah, in the second month of Ramadan, we bade farewell to the old year by celebrating Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam's commitment to Allah, characterized by his valor against the despotic and pharaonic Nimrud of his time, and verified through his willingness to sacrifice his patient son, Prophet Nabi Ismail, peace be upon both of them. We then welcome the new year by commemorating the struggle of Nabi Musa against the tyrannical pharaoh of his time. And we commemorate as well the martyrdom of the Prophet Muhammad's beloved grandson, Imam Hussain, at the hands of repressive and despotic rulers. And we find, of course, the poet said it so beautifully, Gharib o Saada o Rangeen hai Dastan Haram, Nihayat iske Hussain, Ibtidah hai Ismail. Strange, simple, yet colorful is the story of the Haram. It began with Prophet Ismail and continues through Imam Hussain. I want to, coming back to Imam Hussain, inshallah, towards the end, but talk about the struggle in South Africa and the legacy of struggle. And as was mentioned early on by the Honorable Dr. Aslam Abdullah, apartheid, as we know, means separateness. And it was a system of institutional racial oppression that existed in South Africa and in Southwest Africa, what is now Namibia, primarily from 1948 until 1993, with the first democratic election thereafter. Apartheid, however, was undoubtedly a perpetuation of the European colonialist racist mentality, a mentality of superiority and control over people. People whose lands they invaded, people whose lands they conquered, people whom they subjugated, and of course, whose treasures they exploited and still today continue to undermine. So colonialism, we must remember, inherently is a supremacist and racist program, subjugating people from the Far East to Africa up to the Cape. And it was all about control, and the colonizers used and justified the violence and injustices against their colonized subjects. In fact, the punishment and discrimination that this kind of colonial mentality justified was often violent, and the imperial powers generally had to destroy the governments and systems that already existed in these subjugated lands in order to turn these countries and its people into colonies and subjects. So colonialism was unashamedly brutal. It was a process of taking control of other people's territory. Colonialism was all about one group of people, usually Europeans, establishing control over others. Even those, and of course many did resist that control. And the fighting, of course, was part of their attack, and viciousness was part of their style. But we must remember, colonialism was not only about force, there was a reason behind it. It was about making profits and feeding the greed of European wealthy, stealing the natural resources, and using the locals as subjugated workforce. Colonizers needed forced labor to gain profit, whether they extracted raw materials like gold or silver, whatever it was, or to build railway lines. And it was almost enslaving the people to some extent, and in many parts of Africa, enslavement was the order of the day. So the ideology of colonialism justified violence because they believed it was okay for the self-proclaimed superior people, superior Europeans, to punish those whom they deem inferior. The white man's burden, or the idea that it was the responsibility of the Europeans to civilize these so-called uncivilized non-Europeans. The process of their so-called civilization and civilizing was most uncivilized and dehumanizing, to say the least. Even in their religious preaching, there was a notion of white superiority. We watched movies about Tarzan, and in the heart of Africa, that brave Tarzan, that hero, happened to be a white person. And then a white theology was introduced. A God, son of God, Jesus, was portrayed as man with blonde hair and blue-eyed. In that way, a white philosophy was introduced, a white philosophy of superiority, a white theology was introduced, all based on the European superiority or their notion of superiority. Now, apartheid, or separateness, literally it means separateness, was a system of institutionalized racial oppression that existed and dominated all legislations in South Africa from 1948 until mid-1990s. And apartheid itself was cruelly and forcibly enforced upon people. It separated people. And of course, it had a fearsome state apparatus to enforce its laws and to mercilessly punish those who disagreed with its regulations and its implementation. As an example, it created a national register in which every individual's race was officially recorded, legally codified segregation by creating distinct residential areas for each race. Laws were promulgated, like, for example, the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949 that forbade marriages between so-called white people and people of other races. The Immorality Act of 1950 that forbade relationship between people from different races. In fact, apartheid denied those who were not white their basic human rights, even such as the right to vote. So apartheid too was characterized by a brutal authoritarian political culture based on what they call baaskap. It's a Dutch word for bosshood or bossship, which ensured that South Africa was dominated politically, socially, and economically by the nation's minority white population. And according to this system of social stratification, white citizens always had the highest status over all those who were not white. The best schools, everything the best belonged to the white people. And areas which they wanted to make white, they forcefully removed people from those areas, like in Cape Town, we had District 6, and in Johannesburg, Sophia Town, and so many other places. Not only that, they had passed laws that prohibited people from entering certain areas. And in fact, the indigenous people were not allowed to enter some of the white areas after 6 p.m., except for a valid reason, unless they were working there or that they were called there. So apartheid dictated where South Africans, on the basis of their race or their color, could live, where they could work, the type of education they could receive, who they could marry or not marry, where they could go to school, which facilities they could use, and whether they could vote. Even our bus stops, our toilets, our bathrooms were separated. So apartheid was indeed a social system which severely disadvantaged the majority of the population simply because they did not share the fair skin color of the European descent rulers. It was sometimes, besides being cruel and oppressive, it was sometimes absurd. There is a case called the Dolly Affair. There was a South African outstanding cricket player, and cricket and rugby are the two most famous sports in South Africa. Basil de Oliveira was a colored and non-white cricket player, outstanding cricket player. He was not the best in South Africa among the non-whites, but he was one who then took the opportunity to go overseas. He played for Worcestershire in England, and he made the England team. And Basil de Oliveira made the England team as an Englishman from England, born in South Africa, colored, who couldn't play for his country. He came to South Africa in 1968, and the South African team, the government, refused for them to play against England because he was a non-white. He was South African who achieved the highest, grade of being a batsman, an outstanding batsman for England, accepted the England citizenship, yet he could not play in his own country just because he was not white. That shows you how absurd it was. Not only that, through the apartheid era, many people, hundreds of people were killed, but just as political prisoners and political victims, over 21,000 people were killed in that period. And there were very often bloodbaths, such as the Sharpeville massacre of 1960 and the Soweto uprising in 1976-77. Now, some of the most prominent organizations involved in the struggle for liberation were among them was the African National Congress and, of course, the Pan-Africanist Congress. There were others like the Black Conscious Movement. Now, the African National Congress, which you know is now the ruling party in South Africa, famous names like Albert Luthuli, Nelson Mandela, Ahmed Kathrada, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, Dr. Yusuf Dadoo. All of these, they had even a military wing called the Umkhonto Sizwe. And there were later organizations when the ANC was, of course, banned. There were later organizations like the United Democratic Front, or the UDF, which was formed around 1983 in an area called Mitchell's Plain here in Cape Town. And it was led by a well-known person called Reverend Ellen Busak and others like Trevor Manuel, Ibrahim Rasool, who eventually became the ambassador of South Africa to the United States, Professor Farid Isaac, and Imam Hussain Solomons and other people. The Pan-Africanist Congress, or the PAC, was an offshoot from the ANC and was led by people like Professor Mangaliso Subukwe, Zephania Motopeng, and so on and so forth. And in fact, the PAC was quite instrumental in many of the marches. In fact, the Sharpeville massacre of 1960, that march and things were arranged by the PAC in the anti-pass campaign. So they also had a military wing called POCO. Then there was, of course, the Black Conscious Movement. And the key people there were Steve Biko, as you know, there's a movie made about his life and how he was killed, Cry Freedom. Stephen Biko, he was killed in 1977. So while some of these people were in prison, like Subukwe and Robben Island and Mandela and other people like Ahmed Kathrada and Sisulu and so on, some of the people went underground, and of course, many of the leadership of the ANC and some of the PAC then went into countries like Guinea, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe. And they resisted and fought from the outside. And of course, they worked with the underground forces within the country to eventually bring force upon the white minority rule. And sustained pressure and protest and boycotts by brave people. Many of them, of course, Muslims were involved. And I'll mention a few names afterwards. But sustained pressure eventually led P.W. Botha, who was the ruling National Party leader, to resign in 1989. And his successor, F.W. de Klerk, strategically lifted the ban on the ANC and other Black liberation parties. And of course, eventually, there was in 11th of February, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked free after 27 years in prison. And eventually, de Klerk negotiated with the ANC, and there was the first elections held in 1994, where President Nelson Mandela became the first South African democratically elected to the office of president, and of course, the first non-white president in South Africa. So President Mandela and F.W. de Klerk also received the Nobel Peace Prize at that time. Now, Subukwe and Ahmed Kathrada, people like Mandela, were imprisoned on Robben Island. And this is very important to note because Robben Island is an island 6 kilometers or 7 kilometers for the Americans, 4.5 miles of the coast of Cape Town. And it was a settlement, it was a penal colony, became a leper colony, and eventually it became again from the 1960s to 1990s It served as a maximum security prison where Nelson Mandela, the leader of the ANC, and Robert Sobukwe, the leader of the PAC, and many other people were imprisoned on that island. Many people do not know the longest serving prisoner in this country, and I think maybe in the world, was a person called Jafta Masumela of the PAC, who served 28 years on Robben Island. On Robben Island, by the way, just to bring the Muslim side into it, there's a grave of Sayyid Abdul Rahman Muturu, a political prisoner, was brought to the Cape from Batavia in the 18th century, and he lived for 11 years on Robben Island. He was imprisoned there, in fact, and his grave still lies there. Not only that, we need to understand that long before the time of Mandela, people like Qadi Abdul Salam, popularly known as Tuan Guru, was a prince from Tidore in the Ternate Islands of Indonesia. And he was brought to the shores of this land on April 6, 1780, as a state prisoner because he opposed Dutch colonialism in Indonesia, in the Malay archipelago. This Tuan Guru, while imprisoned on Robben Island, he was a Hafiz of Qur'an, and he wrote the first Qur'an in South African soil from memory while in prison, smuggled out the pages. In fact, the Qur'an that he wrote more than one copy thereafter, but the one that he smuggled from is in a mosque called the Awwal Masjid, which is here in Cape Town. It's still being used, that masjid. And when he was freed after 13 years on Robben Island, he did two things. He became the Imam of that mosque, and secondly, he also opened a school which was open to everybody, irrespective of color, irrespective of religion. But also among the people who gave their lives in the struggle, religious people like Maulvi Ismail Ahmad Kachalia in 2003, Ahmad Timol, a teacher, 1971, Dr. Abu Bakr Azwat, a medical practitioner, 1989, Shahid Imam Abdullah Harun, a religious leader. So we can see that the struggle has been intertwined with a opposition to colonialism from the outset. It has been brutal throughout from the beginning, and the struggle that we have been involved in over the period of time from the 17th century, when people were brought as political exiles from the Malay archipelago and to South Africa, people like Sheikh Yusuf and Matera and Matebi Shah and many of the other great people who came here. They came here as political prisoners, and Qadi Abdul Salam and others who fought for justice. So when we look at the struggle of the people of South Africa, one thing is very unique about South Africa. Though the Muslims are a minority, we were inherently part of the struggle from the time the colonialists arrived. In fact, the first political prisoners were people who were Muslim, who were brought here because they opposed the Dutch, who were occupying the land here, but who had already occupied and subjugated the people in the Far East through the Dutch East India Company and so on. So coming back and looking at the legacy and struggle of the people in South Africa, we look back at the life of Imam Hussain and the memory of Imam Hussain. And therefore, when you look at this, Imam Abdullah Harun himself too, very inspired by the life of the Prophet and his family and those around him. The memory of Hussain excites the spirit. And for us, the very name of Hussain evokes the tradition of resistance against tyranny and inequity. And his colossal struggle and monumental martyrdom is so poignant that he continues to serve as a beacon of light to all the faithful who struggle for freedom and justice. We learn from the lives of people like Ibrahim against Nimrud alayhi salam, of Ibrahim alayhi salam against Nimrud, of Nabi Musa against Fir'aun, of Imam Hussain against Yazid, that their lives and their struggle provide evidence of the moral victory of right over wrong, of virtue over vice, of principle over compromise, of the oppressed over the oppressor, of the denied over the denier, and ultimately, I believe, the victory of blood over sword.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brother Sadullah, for this elucidating description of what happened in South Africa. And certainly you Muslims against apartheid. Your take on that, and please take it to a different level in terms of Southern in your comments.
Jazakallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, Imam Sadullah, for that brilliant exposition and taking us, through the struggles and connecting that these and people who the Cape Malays as I hold that into focus. And truly, this is a revelation. It takes me back to my very first visit to Cape Town, which is where you are based. And those were the days when you had the now equipped bottom cameras so that we could view landscape as we were flying into a place. And I saw the camera, through the camera, panning over immaculate suburb with beautiful lawns and homes. And that kind of was my first impression of Cape Town. And then suddenly it's over the highway, and suddenly the shanties appear near the airport, as it's the international airport. And then subsequently, the drive and the various visits to as you mentioned, District 6 and really was an addition, visiting town in the way they did. In fact, a total history of apartheid visually emerging in front of my eyes. And when I refer to this, for those, perhaps you'll elucidate a little bit on District 6 and work up if we have more time. But this was really the legacy of apartheid that you mentioned. And also it took me back personally to my childhood days in Moshi, Tanzania, where I grew up. And a similar case of 3 residential areas, the African area near my small town airport, the Indian area as you traveled, within the middle of the town. And then as you went further north, you had the lush landscape, green lawns where the Europeans lived. And, you come to realize that the entire structure, for example, of Cape Town, and why the shanties were there near the airport rather than commercial structures, and how the highways and the railroads were in fact clearly designed to create that division between the racial groups is all part and parcel of the history that you elucidate. Yet, the peaceful transfer of power from the white minority, I would say police state, to the African majority after 46, I think, years of apartheid is a modern miracle. We always remember and mention, and everyone does, that Nelson Mandela, Bishop Tutu, preached that reconciliation, truth, commissions, there were no executions, no mass incarcerations, no forced exiles. There were some voluntary exiles that we know about, but no forced exiles, as it were. And it reflects me back to think, I'm not sure whether Nelson Mandela ever came across Imam Hussain, but I do know this, that Mahatma Gandhi was inspired by Imam Hussain alayhi salam. And Mahatma Gandhi inspired Martin Luther King, and I do know from his writings that Nelson Mandela was very much influenced by both Mahatma Gandhi as well as Martin Luther King. So here lies in the correction that you mentioned in terms of fighting and standing up and speaking truth to power. But this miracle, and I see some parallels in the fact that you've lived in both continents, apart from the many places that you have lived as just described by Aslam Bhai. This did not bring, to the sort of end of the oppression, and it continues. But at least it was not as violent as the end of slavery in the US. But there are some commonalities, that the end of slavery in the US and the end of apartheid in South Africa did not end in inequity. In fact, it still prevails. And just as a freedom in 1865, the slaves did not end that inequality and poverty. The end of apartheid and the peaceful transfer of political power to the majority African population could not but itself change the economic of South Africa or eliminate the effects of apartheid. So given that you're familiar with both these landscapes, perhaps you may want to shed a little bit more light as to where do you see the opportunities in some practical forms, so that this journey that was started ends in the removal of those inequities and injustices, which is what we are all inspired by, and we believe in social justice. That is why we are here, in the almost for us in the middle of the night, for you in the morning, that we are discussing this particular subject. I will stop that reflection because I'd like to yield as much time as we can to learn, from your, great experiences. And I say I've always admired your work. I've followed your writings, and it's truly been an education, although we never had the opportunity to spend some quality time together, which I hope I will do when I come to Cape Town. Thank you.
Inshallah. Thank you. You're very appropriate and apt and insightful perspective that you have presented there, and put a whole ocean in a cup, so to say. But Doctor, you need to understand, that's why the struggle of Imam Hussain is so important. You see, there's two parts to my response. One is, first of all, we need to know from where we have come to know where we are. And that legacy, that history is a very proud one. But also, we need to know where we're going to. We know from where we have come. The question now lies, in which direction are we going? That is the issue, because the direction in which we are going may undermine the entire legacy from where we have come. Because it must be worth it. If you haven't freed the oppressed people, if you haven't liberated those who have been downtrodden, even if uplifted those who are impoverished, then you have just won a political fight. You haven't really liberated the people. And this is very, very important to understand. And that is why the imamate or the leadership of Imam Hussain is so important. It was not important just to have a leader. It's to have the proper leader, the correct leader, who have the interest of the people at heart. Who's not in there, you look at the struggle of Imam Hussain, you look at the struggle of Ibrahim alayhi salam, you look at Nabi Musa. It was not about politics. It was not about gaining authority. It was not about vested interest for the self and for the family, or for enrichment or entitlement. Rather, it was for the liberation of the people, to bring about what Allah wants, adl and ihsan, justice and goodness. And it's very important to understand, having a Muslim leader or a good leader, or a profound person who you find maybe as a leader, that is not the ultimate objective. In Islam, we have the notion, إن الله ينصر الدولة العادلة ولو كانت كافرة ولا ينصر الدولة الظالمة ولو كانت مؤمنة. Allah will support a just system even if people in authority are not believers. He will not support an unjust system even if people are believers. So the very important to understand is what you do with the leadership. So this is the first point. In other words, we know from where we've come. The question is, in which direction are we heading? And the leadership, secondly, that we have, is it a leadership, a principled leadership, a leadership of integrity, a leadership because people gave their lives in the struggle? I mentioned some people. And that is why we look at Imam Hussain. He really gave his life against all odds. It's strange. And he was killed by people who read Takbir while they were killing him. So they used religion and they killed the most religious person they could find. And this is the issue in South Africa as well at the moment in time. There's a culture of entitlement almost that has emerged among some people. That, we fought in the struggle, but they were not there in the struggle. It may be their forefathers were involved or some people were involved. And just because you're black or white doesn't mean you are part of the struggle or against the struggle. You are who you are right now. But we need to perpetuate the legacy, the principles, the values for which people like Mandela, for which people like Robert Sobukwe stood for and they fought for. Some of those things are being undermined. And I think the other point I want to make is, do not forget, the colonialist never leaves. They never leave. They're always in power, even up till now. When they, like in Namibia, the other country which also had apartheid and it was joined to South Africa was Namibia, which was called Southwest Africa. While negotiating for the freedom of Namibia and to have democratically free elections, the forces, the British and the Germans, mined those areas, looted those areas to such an extent that when independence did come, they were so impoverished, so much of their wealth already overseas, that they could flood the world market with rubies and diamonds and so on and so forth, to the extent that the new government that came into power was almost with their minerals and things and resources at the begging door of the Europeans, because there was no way they could get those things on the market, because the market was already dominated. So do understand, the colonialists didn't just leave when they left. They never intended to leave. They came here for our resources. Now they find a way, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes by installing puppets, or sometimes by undermining the democratic structures within the country to be able to maintain. And therefore, most of Africa, the wealth does not belong to the African people. It's very often still linked to Europe. It's still processed in Europe. It's still polished in Europe. It's still sold through the European markets. It's still related to the dollar and to the pound rather than to the local currency. So in South Africa, I think we have an opportunity where we have a very wealthy country. We have a working democracy, a constitutional democracy. We have freedoms which are still very, very impactful and really visible, and there's no question about it. I can say whatever I want in this country without fear whatsoever, against the government, for the government, about religion, whatever it may be, as a Muslim too. So we need to utilize this opportunity to be able to ensure that right-minded people reinforce or bring to life again or revive the legacies and the principles of people like Mandela and Sobukwe, which somewhat seems to be fading at the hands of people who are in power right now and who may not be worried about the legacy as much as enriching themselves. And don't forget the after effects of colonialism, of apartheid. Still now, we still live in areas, the blacks still live in black areas. Only those among the rich who somewhat became empowered are able to buy in other areas. Majority of blacks still live in black areas, and majority of whites still live in white areas. So that after effect of apartheid and colonialism continues at least for 2-3 decades.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brother Sadullah. 2 questions. One is, where was the religious conscience of Christians and Jews during the apartheid? And yesterday, Pope Francis made a statement that the Portuguese, the Europeans, the Italians, and the Spanish colonization was no less than genocide. How come these people realize the reality 300 or 400 years after the event? Is there something in their consciousness that prevents them from reaching to the conclusion that human beings are equal, that no one is superior over the others? What is your take on that?
Yes, it's a very valid question, Dr. Aslam. I think, first of all, I must mention in South Africa, there was a participation by people from different faiths, Christian, Muslim, Jewish. As you know, of course, Bishop Desmond Tutu, a very well-known, Nobel Prize, Peace Prize winner, internationally recognized personality, as well-known perhaps as Nelson Mandela. These people, they were always part of the struggle. Even in the Jewish community, there have been people who have been very much central to this struggle. And there's even many of them who are still involved, are not necessarily Zionist inclined. All those who were involved with Mandela seem to have taken a stance very openly pro-Palestine and so on and so forth. But besides that, my point I'm making is it was not purely a Muslim thing, or the people of other faiths were not involved. They were equally involved. People like Reverend Ellen Busak, these were people who played a key role in the struggle against apartheid. So I don't think that applies to South Africa as much. Coming to the question of the Pope, after 200 or 300 years, that now they mention about what happened in Spain and other parts of Europe and call it a genocide. I think it's not a Christian or a Jewish or a Muslim thing. I think it's just very hard because sometimes you try to justify religiously what you've done, or by acknowledging the errors of the past, you almost indict, it seems, your religion, because you sometimes preach that your religion is peace and justice and love. And then you find the episodes in our history which were not like that, even in Muslim history. So we're not always very honest religion, because we try to keep the religion pure, so we sanitize our history, not realizing that if people did wrong in the name of religion, it's not because of the religion. It's the Yazid killed Imam Hussain. It had nothing to do. He had no stance on Islam, but it's part of a dark spot in the history of Islam, because Imam Hussain was killed. But it needs guts from people in history, irrespective of the school of thought, to acknowledge who was wrong, what wrong was done. Even in the Muslim community, we still don't do that. How many people who shy away even from mentioning the memory of Imam Hussain, for that matter? So we need to be aware that it's not a partial thing, that, you know, that Christians don't acknowledge, they're only acknowledging after 300-400 years. Partly it could be because people who are representing a particular faith may not want or may not admit to certain things because it may indict their faith, they feel, which I believe is not the case. If people did wrong in the name of Islam or the name of Christianity, it was not Christianity or the Bible that drove to that. It was a kind of a superiority mentality, sometimes promoted by the church, because they were in cahoots with the governments and the powers of that time. But I do not think it's the religion in itself that motivates that. In South Africa, certainly, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim people were virtually equally involved in the struggle. Even the political and the religious leaders were involved in the struggle here.
Dr. Balji, your comments?
It's interesting. You mentioned that colonialists never leave. And my observation, and I'd love to get your response on this, is true. The entire issue of colonialists, the powers that and the wealth that you mentioned are absolutely true. I'd like to take this in a slightly different dimension and say, what about the colonialist mindset that they leave amongst the people that they've colonized, which seems to be also a factor in where we are going to go. So what's your take on how do we go about mitigating the colonial mindset, that, particularly in the British Commonwealth, that the colonial mindset that prevails amongst those who are colonized?
Yeah, I think we still have an inferiority complex. Despite us saying what we are saying, we still consider, Europe or European to be somewhat superior. We don't say it in so many words, but somehow we acknowledge it. If someone is studied in an institution in Europe, we'll count it higher, even if it's higher than the Azhar or something else. We don't seem to have pride in our own. We seem to have lost. We have a sense of shame of even our great ones. And I think part of the problem also lies in how Muslims in particular have made a dichotomy between a secular learning and religious learning. That dichotomy did not originally exist. If you look at the class of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq or Musa al-Kadhim, in this class was Imam Abu Hanifa. In the same class was Jabir ibn Hayyan. You did not have a madrasa for Imam Abu Hanifa and a school for Jabir ibn Hayyan. In the same class, they saw things from a Tawheedi perspective. And that class could produce people who became great scientists, and that class could produce people who were great fuqaha, and so on and so forth. What we have done, specifically in the countries where there were colonial rule, they somewhat perpetuated the idea, and we have somewhat still fallen for that, where we separate. If you want to become a Maulana, you go to Darul Uloom. If you want to become a Sheikh, you go to Darul Uloom. And what can you do being a Maulana or a Sheikh? You can maybe give lecture, give khutbah, give names. But if you want to have political power, if you want to be in the corridors of power, key state positions, influence in the society beyond the Muslim community, then you go to Sorbonne University or you go to Harvard. So we become accustomed to that. And that was further exacerbated by the fact that even some of our ulama then went and said, Christian studies, going to study secular studies is not Islamic, Islamic studies is more important, but secular studies is secondary. Even our girls shouldn't go to secular schools or do secular learning. So we exacerbated the matter by entrenching the dichotomy. In Islam, ilm is ilm. Knowledge is knowledge. All knowledge which is based on fact and which is beneficial, that's ilm. So part of the reason that we are stuck in this is because there's a dichotomy between how we perceive knowledge and understanding, and hence our civilizational impact is limited. So unless we get Africans are proud of being Africans, whether you're black or white, don't buy whitening cream to look like the white man, look the best black that you can be, you know. So the point is, we have lost, or some of us have lost pride in who we are. I don't mean arrogance, I mean pride in who we are. And therefore, we allow ourselves to become subsumed by the dominant culture. Look, I'm in South Africa. You are in America. You're originally from Tanzania. Our forefathers came from India. And the common language you speak is the language of people who colonized us. We're speaking the language in English language. You are not in England. I'm not in England. But we're speaking English. Look at the influence they had. That even we are speaking as two people, originally forefathers from maybe India. You were in Tanzania, born there. I'm born here. You're in America. I'm in Cape Town. And the common language we had is that of our colonial master. This indicates the extent we think in that language. We think in the idiom. We think like Shakespeare. We don't think like Iqbal. We don't think like Rumi. We learn Rumi by translation. We learn Iqbal by translation. And until and unless we can, seize our heritage as a global heritage, not as an Indian heritage or purely Muslim heritage, then I think we can rid ourselves of the colonialist mentality, because we somehow perpetuate it. And of course, the colonialist agenda is still intact.
Well, that was wonderful. Where should we go from here now? After all, we tend to believe in what you have talked about, and there is consensus among Dr. Walji and you and us believing that things should not be left as they are. If we truly believe in the legacy of Imam Hussain, if we truly believe in the message of Islam, of egalitarianism, where should we go from here now?
I think that we need to begin by, as Muslims, begin to understand that Islam is not a religion. We all say that, but it's cliched. We need to understand Islam as a civilizational force. This is very important. It's not whether people, even if people are not Muslim, they're welcome not to be Muslim. But how does my being Muslim have a positive impact upon those around me? How does my Islam benefit other people? How does my being a Muslim bring light to the darkness around me? Not by bringing other people to Islam, and certainly not by debating about unnecessary secondary issues about madhab and so on and so forth. But we are in a global crisis. The whole world is going through trials and tribulations. What solution can we bring forth? So I think going back to the Qur'an, going back to the legacy of Islam, looking at our own struggles, and understanding the text of the Qur'an, and also perhaps if we can get our scholars, which is a very difficult thing to do, to come together and look at Islam as a civilizational force, and to say, look, these are some of the key, and Dr. Aslam, you write about these things in your articles and so on. What is it that we can do? What is it that we need to do to address the issues that need to be addressed, so that we can be a source of benefit to humanity at large, as Islam came to be? When Rasulullah came, he came as rahmatan lil alameen, a mercy unto all existence. He brought the book of mercy, shifa wa huda wa rahma, from the most merciful. And if we can manifest that compassion, that mercy, irrespective of whether people are of our faith or not, and look at the civilizational heritage, the civilizational legacy of Islam beyond madhahib and differences, and say, look, if we look at the world in the direction which is going, it seems to be bereft of ethics, of morals, of empathy. Islamic civilization has had it. Muslims may have lost it. let's take a relook at the civilizational heritage of Islam, the legacy of Islam, and we as Muslims come together and say, these are elements and streams of that legacy which are relevant for today, and this is our input regarding these matters.
Dr. Wazi, would you like to add anything?
I will yield my time to you, Dr. Aslam. I'd love to hear your take in a response to the wonderful words that have just been said on this whole issue. So please.
I think one of the most pressing tasks before us today is to ensure that we Muslims, regardless of our factions, regardless of sects, should come together to stand for justice for those who have been denied it for centuries. This is the most pressing theological concern that we should have at this moment, that their conscious efforts should be made by the Shias and the Sunnis to live the legacy of Imam Hussain in terms of challenging the tyranny and in terms of challenging the injustices that have been taking place all around us, whether they involve Muslims or they involve non-Muslims. But we should do in a manner in which we basically take also with us those who come from the Christian and the Jewish and other faiths as well. And in that particular respect, I think the example of South Africa is a shining example, and we should definitely learn from that to see how we can promote those kind of ideals that we have. With that, I think I would ask you to say a few words, and then we would ask Brother Sadullah for the concluding dua. And Brother Sadullah, thank you very much for taking the time out and be part of this discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aslam Abdullah, and to the IslamiCity and the people who are involved there, Dr. Walji. It's truly been an honor and a privilege, and I thank you very much for honoring me with this opportunity to say a few words regarding this important manner and for participating in this most wonderful and empowering and enlightening theme which you have chosen, which is very, very unique, by the way. So 2 points. One is on Imam Hussain and Muharram we are in. And second is, of course, I want to leave with maybe a phrase that could be means, having heard what Dr. Aslam Abdullah says, the phrase from the Qur'an or the verse which can bring us maybe together and focus our attention on what is important. Let me begin with Imam Hussain. I think we have learned from the commemoration of Ashura on the 10th of Muharram, which we do every year. It serves to remind us of the sacrifices of the righteous people throughout our glorious history. And it reconnects us with our spiritual and moral legacy, making us aware of people then and now who bravely stood up for what is right, as well as those who supported them and those who acknowledged that reality. May Allah grant us to be of those who stand up for justice, to stand up for truth, but always of those who manifest excellence and those who reflect compassion and mercy. Allah is Rahman Rahim, Rasul is Rahmatan lil Alameen, Quran is Shifa wa Huda wa Rahma, believers are Ruhama'u baynahum, and Man la yarham la yurham, the one who does not show mercy will not receive mercy. So Allah is merciful, the Quran is merciful, the Rasul is merciful, as the Quran says. So the revealer, the messenger, the message is mercy. Believers are reflectors of mercy. May we be of those who reflect that string of mercy, that light of mercy. And the last point is, let us, I think, in keeping with what Dr. Aslam said and Dr. Walji as well, let us perhaps make our motto and our theme, our focus, a verse which we read virtually in every khutbah all over the world every Friday. Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan wa ita'i dhil qurba. Allah commands justice, excellence and goodness, and the care for your near and dear ones under all circumstances. Adl, ihsan, and ita'i dhil qurba. Justice, excellence and goodness, and caring for those around us, family, friends, And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us the courage of our conviction to do what is best and to perpetuate the legacy of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam and those who walk truly in his footsteps. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashraf al-mursaleen Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi al-tayyibin al-tahirin wa ala ashabihi wa ala jami' al-anbiya wal-mursaleen. Allahumma aftah lana bil-khayr wa akhtim lana bil-khayr waj'al awaqib umurina bil-khayr biyadika al-khayr wal-afiyah innaka ala kulli shay'in qadir. Allahumma ij'al jam'ana hadha jam'an marhuma وتفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما وصلى الله تعالى على خير خلقه ونور عرشه سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته وصحبه سبحان ربنا رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Thank you very much, Brother Sadullah, and thank you very much, Dr. Walji, for being part of this series and part of this program. Tomorrow, we would focus on Uyghur Muslims in China, and after that, we would come to the attempted genocide against Muslims of India, and on the last day, we would focus on where do we go from here now, Dr. Walji and Dr. Abbas, and many others also. So until tomorrow, we say goodbye to you, Assalamu alaikum, and once again, Brother Sadullah, we are really honored to have you in the program and benefit from your wisdom and your experience and knowledge. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect you and your family. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother Ali.